This is a Momentum Media production. Space Connect podcast. Stories, opinion, and insights on the key factors shaping the development of Australia's space industry and how you can connect your business with this emerging sector.
Hello everybody, my name is Adam Thorn and welcome to the Space Connect podcast. Now, if you can hear some chatter behind me, it's because we're recording this at our Australian Space Summit and Exhibition at the ICC in Sydney. We've got our own little podcast booth and I'm delighted to be joined by Paul Hawkins, who is the founder and chief combobulator, you heard that correctly, of a company called Crazy Might Work. And Crazy Might Work kind of describes itself as a for-purpose leadership and innovation academy that was launched in Antarctica and aims to kind of train, develop kind of courageous leaders. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Adam. Great to be here.
Right, so you've got the greatest name of any company, of anyone I've ever featured on this show before. So just to start off with, give us the gist of what it is that Crazy Might Work does.
So, Adam, we really focus on leaders as a critical lever in organizations. Now, we see that they're able to, with the right tools and development, they're able to be dynamic forces for good and for change in the organizations where they operate. So we influence that in a couple of ways, one of which is the NASA 4-dimensional leadership program, so which we run. And that's actually not all about space, although obviously it was designed for the space industry. It actually has got great traction in various government agencies outside of space, but a number of corporates run the program in-house of all different sizes. So from multinationals down to medium and small size businesses. And, you know, what we're hearing and seeing is that it's a real game changer from a cultural perspective, that it really gives leaders the confidence and the skills to build high performing teams in really psychologically safe environments. So we think that's an absolute game changer. A lot of the work that we do outside of that is around innovation. So we work with clinical agencies and emergency services and intensive care, but we work outside of health as well in a number of different areas where innovation is needed, innovative thinking. And so part of what we do there is we bring a cognitive skill set to leaders around different kinds of problem solving, creative problem solving, and different techniques that they can use there to work through really complex problems. So,
and what can I ask? Why Crazy Might Work? Because is this the idea that crazy is good, or is it just something you made up? Like, what's the story behind that?
So it's a bit of a Hollywood meme. It's around that idea that something's just so crazy that it might actually work. You know, so it's normally used to describe something that's really out there in terms of the thinking, and we just thought it would be a great way to attract to us the kinds of clients that we want to work with. We really want to work with organizations that are genuinely wanting to make a step change, and whether that's performance or impact or whatever it is. And so we've just found it's been a filter and a magnet for us, that we've even within government, which is a fairly conservative space, that we found that individuals that are genuinely have a strong change agenda and genuinely wanting to innovate are attracted to the humor and the name. So it's worked well for us. What
I find fascinating about this, and I'm sure you've heard this like 1,000 times, but when you think of, say, how NASA chooses an astronaut, and you think of this idea of the right stuff, and you think of a kind of square-jawed, clean-cut American, and he used to serve in his military, and his dad served in the military, and he's regimented and follows the rules, and Crazy Might Work, it sounds like the opposite of maybe that archaic idea of what space should be. So talk me through that a little bit, because that's almost a different concept to what we're used to.
Yeah, well, I think the selection for space has changed dramatically, right? Because it used to be the big woofy fighter pilot, as you were suggesting. But now when we're thinking more about settlement and long-term occupation of the moon, Mars, there's a very different profile. And that's probably more about research than anything else. So it starts to be a very different kind of person. If you look at the last sort of European Space Agency selection process, you had a person with disability that was selected as part of that final selection. And so we're thinking very differently actually about what the skills are that are required for space. And I guess in our area that flows through, where we're also thinking about individuals that are going to be highly creative. But coming back to your point about how do they get selected, one of the things that we do in our NASA 4-dimensional program is we replicate pretty closely what happens in astronaut training. So we try and keep it absolutely current with the space program, use a lot of simulations. And one of those is actually about astronaut selection. And what it is an exercise that's designed to make you fail. And this is actually the most important psychological trait that selectors are looking for in astronauts. It's not numerical aptitude or ability to multitask. And we sort of imagine that astronauts are the most perfect person, the best of the best, the highest scoring person gets in. But actually what we see is that exercise that's designed to make you fail gets you to feel a bit incompetent in the moment. So you actually fail at something because it's designed to make you do that. And what the assessors are looking for is how do you process that? So emotionally, do you get frustrated and give up and throw in the towel, or do you get angry and become hostile to your colleagues? How do you deal with that? And they're looking for that because if you think about the space program, you're guaranteed to fail at some point. I mean, you're trying things that human beings have never, ever done before. And so that emotional ability to deal with the frustration, the incompetence is a prerequisite, because you're going to be doing things that you're not very good at and might not be good at for a while because you're the only person that can do them in that context. And so that ability to process failure, I think, is the fundamental attribute actually that's required psychologically in astronauts today. So very different to the past.
And this is a bit of a cliche question, but how much of it, particularly in terms of space, how much are these leaders born and how much are they made? And how is it a case that when you're, say, running a course, you're identifying the talent, or are you nurturing them? Can some people just never going to be cut out for it? I mean, how does that kind of work in your eyes?
I'd probably go as far as to say that no leaders are born.
Yeah.
I think that obviously we'd have amongst us, those that have a particular aptitude for it. And so, pick it up very quickly. But I would say it's almost always socialized, right?
Yeah.
That as a youngster, you might be fortunate enough to be exposed to really good leaders and then emulate those social models. But I think fundamentally it's not innate. So anyone can become a better leader. And this is, again, an underlying concept in the NASA program, the idea of distributed leadership, the idea that you and I might be in a team, and at some point, because you're the astrophysicist, you need to lead that discussion about orbits and, re-entry angles and things, because you're the most competent and the most able to make the right decision in that scenario. So the idea that everyone needs to have a level of leadership and to be able to step up when their leadership is required.
Yeah.
So it's a very different structure to what we had historically with a kind of very hierarchical, one person has to know all the answers, make all the decisions. So it's, again, a big shift away from what it was a couple of decades ago.
Yeah. And I know you do like a number of different sort of courses, and you adapt them for different industries. But could you just talk me through some of them and kind of how it works? And again, maybe how you tailor that to the particular client you had? Because I find it quite fascinating. You were saying, like, when NASA do things now, they almost set people up to fail to see how they react. Like, and I think you talked about like using like neuroscience and stuff. How do these courses work?
So the NASA program is probably a good one to talk about, given we're at the Space Connect conference. So what we do with that is we look at neuroscientifically, what do we know about leadership in high-performing teams? So, we've only had neuroscience for a couple of decades now. We've been able to put electrodes on people's heads and see what actually happens in the brain versus what we thought was happening. So some of the theoretical stuff like Maslow's hierarchy and all of those things have really gone by the wayside, because we've seen something quite different. When we look into a brain, we see that the things that we didn't expect to happen are happening. And so thinking about how do you then design a leadership or a team model in a way that creates psychological safety and then builds on that to create high performance is probably the common thread. So it doesn't matter really what industry you're in, that is going to be the same. The human brain is fundamentally wired in the same way, irrespective of that environment. And you can predict to a high degree of certainty how people are going to react given certain social situations. So if you make someone feel excluded from a group, you actually see the same brain pathway light up as if you stabbed them in the leg. So you see a social pain reaction, which is in every way equivalent to a physical pain reaction, which has really changed our thinking about how functional people can be if they're excluded. And so, in fact, you can actually take a Panadol if you're feeling excluded, and you will feel better because it blocks the same pathway. I'm not recommending this.
No.
But it's fundamentally the same pathway, which means your brain is assigning the same priority to feelings of exclusion or not being part of the in-group or whatever that is, as it would if you were literally in physical pain. So those are some of the underpinnings of our programs, which make them transportable. But the space program is still very unique because there's research that happens, analogs of NASA, so in Antarctica and these other training environments in the desert, in Hawaii and other areas that are super pure from a research perspective because you're able to eliminate a lot of variables that happen in the day-to-day. And so when you take a group to Antarctica and they overwinter there, you get a very unique insight into what makes a team cohesive, what kind of leadership promotes that, why do some teams splinter and others stay together. And so you over multiple years that these studies run, you get some very unique insights into the human condition. So it's a great hunting ground, for deep insights into human behavior.
It's interesting. You talked about Antarctica there and obviously think about space. And I suppose if you're working in a kind of harsh environment, if we're calling space that, the last thing you can deal with is office politics or someone getting excluded from the group. I suppose when you're in those situations, you have to run a good team. You have to have good leaders. Otherwise, it all falls apart. It's kind of like I would imagine like a kind of no-nonsense scenario to put people in.
Absolutely. And, I think that all adds to the pressure. So you would think that high-performing astronauts that have been through these incredible selection processes, 22,500 down to 17 in the last ESA selection process, you would think that those individuals are impermeable, right? That they're not able to be influenced by their social environment, but we see that they absolutely are.
Yeah.
So some of the tests that NASA have run in say, the Hawaiian analog show pretty much that you can get an astronaut to break down in a day. You can get them to be pretty dysfunctional.
Yeah.
And when you think that these are such highly psychologically screened people, you go, well, by the end of the day, they're hostile to their colleagues. They're feeling incompetent. They're feeling mistrusted. And that's a particular autonomy study that I'm referring to.
Yeah.
So micromanagement does that even for astronauts. And so they're certainly not uninfluenced by these things. In fact, in many ways, they're probably under more stress and pressure. The studies in Antarctica are called ICE, isolation, confinement, and extreme conditions. So they're looking at how human beings perform under those moments in time. And it's very challenging. So anyone that's been to Antarctica over winter will tell you that it's highly emotional and that their emotions are heightened. They're more inclined to react and start sobbing or get emotional in that environment. So it's a really important part of the training, and in some ways, the most important part is to make sure that people have the leadership and social skills to be able to be on a spaceship for 7 months in confined conditions, and then stay away from home for 2 to 3 years before the orbits align to come back, and then another 7 months in a tin can on the way home. So there's a lot of social stress to deal with in that journey.
And talk me through, I know Crazy Might Work was launched, I think, originally in Antarctica. Talk me a little bit about how this company came into being, because it's not a normal thing to do with your life.
Yes, I actually have a background in mergers and acquisitions, working for multinationals. And when I got down to Antarctica, I'd been thinking about how do we bring more creativity back into business so that it's just not so transactional. Yeah. And so I'd been looking at a few contemporary creative problem-solving methods at the time, things like design thinking and systems thinking. And Antarctica really gave me that kick in the ass to go, it's time to do something different. There's just something about that incredible collaboration that happens in Antarctica, that it's this frontier of human existence and of our planet where people behave a bit differently. There's much higher levels of collaboration, respect for nature, science, all of those kinds of things. So it's a great model for how things could be. And so that gave me the impetus to go, well, where else can we create something like this? And it turns out that space is also one of those frontiers that you generally see very high levels of collaboration that you don't see elsewhere. And I think it's one of those opportunities where you've got very high performing individuals and teams who have the ability to, and you think about our opportunities to reset on the moon or reset on Mars in terms of how society runs and how that gets constituted and set up. I think it's a really exciting time. And those frontiers are interesting places because you see you have a different take on human behavior in those environments.
Who is it that comes to a company like Crazy Might Work and says, we want you to look at our team?
So we work quite extensively in health. So we work in police emergency services, intensive care, clinical innovation, all of those. So about half of our work is there. And then the rest is across a very broad spectrum of different kinds of clients, from regulators like the ACCC through to multinationals of pretty much all descriptions. In terms of the NASA program, there's actually been 1,500 NASA teams that have been through that program, not obviously all with us, predominantly in the States with Charlie Pellerin. So it's a very broad base, and it's probably about half government and then half corporates. And for the corporates, the innovation topic could be anything from mental health in the workplace to a whole new product category or service design if it's in the innovation direction. So incredibly broad range of things. But the NASA program we're finding is just a great foundation for everything else, because it creates a psychologically safe environment in which people can actually innovate, because innovation is just a form of high performance. And we know from studies at Google and some of Amy Edmondson's work that the fundamental prerequisite for any kind of true high performance is psychological safety. If you don't have that, you don't have a starting point.
Can I just say, you talked about psychological safety a few times.
Yeah.
How would you kind of define that? What's a kind of psychological safe environment?
So a psychologically safe environment is one in which you feel free to speak your mind without worrying about being repercussions or being victimized simply for expressing a point of view. So obviously, one would hope that that's done respectfully and in a constructive way, but it's more that freedom to not hesitate to give a perspective that you feel strongly or even moderately. So it's fundamentally the ability to speak up, I think, in an environment. And so we find when that doesn't happen, when it didn't happen at NASA, we had very serious fatalities and mission outcomes. The same is true of health and most environments. When individuals bite their tongue too many times, that lack of safety and freedom to express an alternate opinion creates this kind of groupthink, which is actually very dangerous for the organization.
That's a really fascinating thing to say. If you don't feel you can speak out, then you're losing out on someone's insight. How much of it then, saying if you're, I use the example, if you're a group of astronauts, on the space station or what have you, how much of this is just about how those group of people get on and how the personalities connect or not? And how much of that can you kind of train in, or can you train people? Because I've been in plenty of workplaces where I hate everybody, and I've been in plenty of workplaces where we get on really well. And often it feels to me that, either you have a connection or you don't. How much of that can be trained, and how much is just a happenstance of people having a connection?
I think it's surprising how much of that can be trained, right? Because quite often when you have that disconnect with an individual, you're just getting off on the wrong foot, right? You're probably making assumptions about their agendas and vice versa, and you never quite crack through that. And there's some theory out of management, Tuckman's theory of forming, norming, storming, performing. So we always thought when you put a team together, they kind of fight it out and they come to a happy landing on some team standards and norms, and then hopefully they perform after that once they've kind of resolved all of those tensions. But I think what NASA realized is you can actually do that very intentionally. So you can actually start off by establishing shared interests, getting individuals to talk about what motivates them most deeply, and establishing that much deeper, less superficial human connection at the start. And that's a much more tenable place from which to build a team. And then there's a real focus on strengths development and identification. So what are the things that make Adam idiosyncratically good at what he does, right? So what are those quirks? And really getting into some deep analysis around strengths, which we don't do very often. We spend an awful lot of time thinking about problems, or when people stuff up, we analyze that to death and we know exactly why they made their mistake. But when people do well, we tend to gloss over it and move on, go, good job.
Yeah.
And we never look at that in ourselves. So we don't go, what is it idiosyncratically? So people may have said to you, Adam, you're a good communicator, but what is it about the way that you communicate that is idiosyncratic to you, that is a deep strength? Have you ever done that analysis to go, what am I actually doing when I'm at my best and I'm communicating really well and connecting? What is actually happening in that moment? What am I, leveraging? How am I actually, what is the behavior that is in that moment? And so that's the kind of analysis that we like to do early with teams, so that they develop a strengths inventory almost of the group to know what are the idiosyncratic things that are not in the job description that we would otherwise not know about this person, but are experiences or expertise that they have that are really unique that we can call upon when those things are required. So it's a very different starting point, very strengths orientated, very human connection orientated, and trying to get a bit deeper on that at the very get-go, and establishing a social contract that's very clear and intentional from the beginning.
What is it that caused, talking of NASA, what has it caused NASA to go from this kind of old-fashioned right stuff mentality to actually being very innovative and forward-thinking? Was there a particular moment where they thought we got it wrong, or did this just slowly evolve over time?
No, I think there's a definite inflection curve that you can see in their history. So the Apollo program obviously was incredibly successful. We owe so much to the Apollo program. We've got 2,500 inventions in our homes, in our lives that we otherwise probably would not have. So you think computer, laptop, mouse, but things like MRI, CAT scans, some of those medical breakthroughs are a direct result of that space program. But what you find is when those engineers started to retire at the end of the Apollo program, we got into the Shuttle program, we started to see a litany of failed missions. So you had, obviously, Challenger was very dramatic, but you had back-to-back failed Mars missions. You had, obviously, Hubble go to space and not work. You had the Columbia disaster. So there was a trail of failed missions during that period. And that's when NASA realized there was something fundamentally wrong with the culture and the leadership style within the organization. And then this program, which Charles Pellerin introduced, the 4-dimensional leadership program, is what, to a large degree, turned that around. So NASA have just been named Best Place to Work 11 years in a row. And that coincides very much with when that program came into being, and sort of a decade on, they started to be, again, a very desirable, probably similar to what they were back in the Apollo era, but it's now a much more diverse organization. They've been able to attract people from all walks of life. If you look at a picture of NASA in the 60s, it was all white male, middle-aged men, and now it represents pretty much the planet. If you look at the diversity across NASA, and I think it's because of the culture, and the way that leaders have changed that over that intervening period, having lost their way, I think, a bit in the 80s and 90s.
So what's next? Sort of almost like, what's the future for Crazy Might Work? And also sort of NASA sort of training as well, because I imagine that you're constantly updating and innovating and changing things as you progress.
Absolutely. We're always talking to astronauts and astronaut trainers so we can understand what is being implemented in the training from a social perspective. But we're also looking very closely at the research. So there's a bunch of people locked up in a room at the moment simulating Mars conditions. There's a lot of research that will come out of that. Similarly, there's the ongoing research in all of the analogs. And so we're looking at that and going, how does that change our thinking about leadership or about high-performing teams, and then tracking that into the program. But at the same time, NASA are huge fans of simulation. So we try to make those experiences as emotional and immersive as they possibly can, because we know people don't learn that well when there's no emotional attachment to the outcome. And so we try to create as real as possible situations under which they get to acquire those new skills and put them into practice with a team. So that's really where our eyes are at the moment in terms of that program, is just making sure that it's absolutely as up to date with the space program and it reflects current training, current thinking at any point in time.
So if somebody's listening and they want to get in touch, what's the best way to find out about Crazy Might Work? Is it your website? Is there an email? If they want to get in touch with you, how do they do it?
Well, certainly, I think the Crazy Might Work, crazymightwork.com website is the place to go and be amazed. But we do have details about the NASA program on that, as well as the other programs that we run. So that's a good starting point. And
absolutely, finally, I wasn't going to ask this: why Chief Combobulator? Why pick that one? I need to know that before we go.
I think it's just a bit of tongue in cheek. It's probably made up on a Friday afternoon over a wine, but we encourage all of our team to do that. To have a bit of fun with their titles, and so that's really how that came about. Combobulator is a machine basically that crunches through information and tries to sort it out and put it in order. So that's very much what I am, and but it's more about having fun and not turning up with serious titles when we're trying to do a serious job, but one that requires a safe and a fun environment. So that's what that's all about.
Well, I think we are just about out of time, but Paul, thank you so much. This is fascinating.
Thanks so much, Adam. Really enjoyed chatting with you.
No, thank you very much. And we will be back on this show the same time next week. But from now, from us, goodbye.